Good evening. Welcome to the webinar, The Right to Vote, Past, Present, and Future. This is co-sponsored by the Center of Politics and the People at Ripon College and the League of Women Voters of the Ripon area. We are recording this event and we will send you all the link to the recording afterwards. Despite all the distracting background noise and disrespect we're hearing during the election cycle, and in the first presidential debate last evening, it's very important that we take some time to reflect on the important historical events we are celebrating this year that really have strengthened our democracy. This year, we celebrate the centennial anniversary of two of those very critical events. The passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, granting women the right to vote, ratified first by our own state of Wisconsin, that resulted after 70 years of struggle by such valiant women as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, and others. One of those heroic women leaders for women's suffrage was Carrie Chapman Catt, originally from Ripon, Wisconsin. And she was the founder and first president of the League of Women Voters, also in 1920. And so the second centennial we celebrate this year is the creation of the League of Women Voters, which continues to be the premier nonpartisan voting rights organization in our country, professing as its mission, empowering voters, defending democracy. To celebrate these valiant women and the relevance of their accomplishments for our time, we have invited several panelists this evening to discuss the struggle to expand and protect suffrage in the United States. I will now ask our moderator, Ellen Sorensen, to introduce our panel. Ellen is a Ripon College alumna. She's former director of the Ripon Chamber of Commerce and a member of the League of Women Voters of the Ripon area. Ellen, your mic is not on.
There, sorry. We have three very esteemed panelists with us tonight. I'm going to briefly introduce them. They're very accomplished, but we need to be able to hear from them. Genevieve McBride is a professor of history emerita at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, has written and lectured extensively on the 19th Amendment. She will address Carrie Chapman Catt's role in achieving women's suffrage and how that struggle is relevant for protecting the right to vote today. Dr. Deborah Turner, who is coming up as Barry Burden, but that was a technical issue. So Dr. Turner is the 20th president of the League of Women Voters of the United States, and she will speak on what the challenges are today in promoting voting rights for all Americans. Finally, Dr. Barry Burden, professor of political science and director of the Elections Research Center and the Lyons Family Chair in Electoral Politics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, will address issues of voting methods, especially mail-in ballots and voter ID laws. So we will begin, each panelist has a question that they will specifically answer, and we are going to begin with Dr. McBride. Dr. McBride, as we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, what can we learn today from Carrie Chapman Catt and others who struggled to make it happen?
Thank you. Yes, I was asked to address Carrie Chapman Catt's role in achieving women's suffrage and how that struggle is relevant for protecting the vote today. First, for historical context, imagine a little girl born during Lincoln's first presidential campaign and born in the town where his anti-slavery third party had begun only 5 years before but would win the White House. Then came the Civil War, a tumultuous time to grow up, but a time of optimism too, when it was won and so was the end of slavery. And then the 13th Amendment, which put Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation into our Constitution. But then, when that little girl was 10, came the 14th and 15th Amendments, for rights for freed men, but only men, as those amendments put gender into our Constitution for the first time. We're going to talk about the Declaration of Independence. No, the Constitution, no gender until 1869. And then came a formative moment in that girl's life when she was shocked to learn that she would not have the right to vote. I find similar stories from other women leaders of her era. And I also find a similarity in that many had early careers as journalists. That is the first of 3 points about Chapman Catt's role: that she was a journalist, that she was a strategist, and that she was a Midwesterner. Journalism provided experience in writing and public speaking when women were supposed to stay in what was called the private sphere. But a public opinion campaign's success relies on these tactics to inform and persuade the public to support a cause. Second, and more important, a public opinion campaign requires strategy, and Catt was called a brilliant political strategist. For example, she came into a movement that was divided over strategy. The first suffrage organization had been founded by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1869, when the 14th and 15th Amendments for men meant that women would have to win another amendment of their own. Their first strategy was to win state by state, rather than fight for a federal amendment. But the latter became the strategy of a later organization. They eventually merged, but remained divided on this until Chapman Catt announced what was called her winning plan that combined both strategies based on her insight into our political process. Now, many of us did not understand the Electoral College process until we had to learn it the hard way 20 years ago. But decades before, her plan called for women to build political pressure for a federal amendment by first winning state by state, either with full suffrage or partial suffrage in presidential elections only, which first was won in Illinois in 1913. And women had won full suffrage in some states as early as 1869. So millions of women voted in the election of 1916. And then as women won more state suffrage amendments, including in Carrie Chapman Catt's New York, they won a sufficient number of states to win the Electoral College. That put pressure for a federal amendment for full suffrage on political parties facing the election of 1920. That is why the president caved to Chapman Catt in 1918. So the House voted by only one vote for the Anthony Amendment, as it was named for its author until it got a number. Then the Senate finally passed the amendment in 1919 by only 2 votes and sent it to the states for ratification a year and a half later in 1920. Now, strategy also is why Carrie Chapman Catt already had renamed the first suffrage organization since 1869 as the League of Women Voters in 1920. Because another basic of public opinion campaigns is that support, once won, must be maintained because the struggle never ends. Remember, the 18th Amendment soon was repealed, and women faced and fought repeal campaigns against the 19th Amendment. So our role today also is to understand our Constitution, our political process, and to think and act not just with tactics like writing and speaking out, but with a larger strategy. Finally, I leave you with this point. That Carrie Chapman Catt was a Midwesterner mattered. The leadership of the movement always had been Easterners. And then as now, we do things differently in the Midwest, especially our politics. She understood what we face here. One of my favorite quotes of hers to the press was about that state to our south, with the city that is the capital of the Midwest. Chapman Catt said about Chicago politics, and I quote, "Dead men vote, as do men who never have been born, and yet the women are not let in with the boys, or not until she won the vote for us." So her role and that of the League is to encourage and educate women new to politics as to what was ahead, including political corruption, so that it would not discourage them and suppress their vote. That is a message that resonates today from Chapman Catt and Anthony and Cady Stanton through their legacy that is the League of Women Voters, which is ahead for us tonight.
Thank you, Dr. McBride. The next question, Dr. Turner will address. Dr. Turner, on this, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the League of Women Voters, what do you see as the most critical issues today in protecting and expanding suffrage in our country?
I'm going to start with something that you're probably not going to think of as the first thing to talk about when we're talking about protecting and expanding suffrage, and that is demanding a fair, impartial, and complete census. Every person should be counted, regardless of their citizenship status. And why is this critical to us expanding, protecting the vote in our country? Because sometimes we forget that how it is determined who our representatives in Congress should be, how many representatives we have, is by the census. So therefore, if we are undercounted, we will end up not having adequate representation in Congress for our jurisdictions. We will therefore lose funding. We will therefore not have the things that we need to make democracy work. And so if I can say nothing else tonight, we have to push for a complete and impartial census, because the count that we do this year will make a difference in the next 10 years as we're looking at voting issues and representation. So the next thing I'd like to point out as very critical for voting and suffrage in our country is eliminating all forms of voter disenfranchisement or suppression, which is the other term that's used. And what does this mean? This means supporting and passing the Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2019, which has now been renamed the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act of 2020. So as you may know, in a case in 2013, Shelby versus Holder, the most powerful provision of the Voting Rights Act that was passed in 1965 was struck down. That provision required states with a history of racial discrimination in voting to get pre-certification in advance of changing any election laws. That was to ascertain there would not be discrimination. States that came under that jurisdiction were Alaska, Alabama, Arizona, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Texas, and Virginia. So what we have seen since that was struck down is significant efforts to restrict the voting. One of the first things that happened in one of those states particularly was that strict voter ID laws were passed, first in one state and then across the nation. We saw things happening like, believe this or not, these things were associated with the Voting Rights Act. The fact that we saw long lines, we saw closed sites, and we saw one thing that is dear to my heart and makes me a little bit, bothers me most, is major voter roll purges. And that means people's names being removed from the polls many times and in too many situations without them even knowing that they have been removed. So it is very critical that we get our Senate to vote on this issue, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act Reenactment Act. This will make all the difference in how voting proceeds in this country and its equality. And then let's talk about access. Access just doesn't mean if you have a polling site in your community, although that's a critical part to have polling sites that are adequate. But it means guaranteeing and assuring access to the vote. We forget there are many people who have special needs around voting. They have disabilities sometimes, that may be sight, that may be transportation, and all these things decrease the access to the vote that our citizens should have. There were a couple voting rights actions that were taken. We have the HAVA, which is the Help America Vote Act, and PAVA, which is the Protection and Advocacy for Voting Access, that were passed under the Bush administration. These were passed specifically to help us make sure that we could have adequate voting for everyone. And finally, the last thing I'd like to push at this point is gerrymandering, eliminating racial and political gerrymandering. With gerrymandering, representatives select their voters. They do not, the voters do not select their representatives. Gerrymandering in the United States at this time is an critical issue, and this is an activity that the League has taken on. We are fighting to change in all 50 states, plus DC and Puerto Rico. So we are encouraging you to get engaged and remember that these are the things that make voting hard in America, and these are things that are changeable by us and by our representatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. Our next question will be for Dr. Burden. Based on your research on absentee voting, voter ID laws, and other issues related to voting rights, what would you say are the most critical problems we face with the constitutional right to vote and issues related to representation now? And what solutions do you suggest for resolving these? Also, for those arguing in favor of more restrictive ballot requirements based on concerns about voter fraud, what do we know about the prevalence of it in previous elections?
Thanks, Ellen. I think it's helpful to divide this question into two layers. One layer is about the access to voting and what barriers are put in front of voters. Are those justified? And the second layer is sort of the higher level structure of election systems that may make some voters' ballots worth more than others. So they create inequalities. And maybe I'll start there because we just heard a moment ago about gerrymandering as a concern. This is a prime example of the ways in which some voters' influence is greater than others. And it makes, in its worst circumstance, and I think Wisconsin is sort of a poster child for this, the legislature unresponsive to voters. Although the votes for Democrats and Republicans have risen and fallen over the last decade in Wisconsin, the makeup of the state legislature has not budged. And that's in large part because the design of the districts has impeded the influence of voters and really diluted the weight of some voters compared to others. And so even if everyone has equal access to the ballot, what's done with those ballots in terms of turning those into representation is problematic. And I think a related structure that is like gerrymandering but has a much older history is the Electoral College. It's obviously baked into the Constitution. It's a different story, but it also has the effect of giving some voters more influence over the selection of the president and the vice president than others. Now, I enjoy the attention we get in Wisconsin from the campaigns. We're seeing lots of candidate visits and advertising and efforts to win our votes because Wisconsin is a key battleground state in the Electoral College. But there are huge swaths of this country that will essentially see no presidential campaign this fall, no visits from the candidates, no advertising, no interest in hearing from those voters. That includes red states like Oklahoma and blue states like California. It includes big cities in red states like Dallas and other big cities in blue states like Chicago. Those are places the candidates are essentially ignoring to put their attention on 5 or 10 states that are likely to decide the election. And because the populations of the states have grown more unequal over time since the founding of the country, today the biggest state and the smallest state differ by a factor of about 60. You have an electoral college that is distorting the vote more severely than it has in the past. So this is a looming problem that's not going away and has had a kind of bite in recent years, the way Jen mentioned that it had not before the year 2000, say. So that's on the structural side. I think on the voter side, the things we focus on in terms of voter access are voter ID requirements and absentee balloting rules. This year, there's a lot more interest in absentee balloting. Perhaps a majority of the electorate will vote by mail this year. That's a huge change from just 4 years ago when only about a quarter of voters cast their ballots by mail. And we are learning about the barriers to voting by absentee that exist in so many states. I think misleadingly, some people will call absentee voting convenience voting or a convenience voting method. It's actually not convenient for a lot of people. It is a multi-step process that requires a voter to act pretty early. According to the Postal Service's own standards for delivery this year, they're recommending that voters start this process 2 weeks before the deadline for returning ballots so that there's time to receive a ballot, mark it, and then return it to the polling place or to your election official. And preceding that is the need to become registered, and in states like Wisconsin, to get a voter ID. So the voter ID requirement, which I think was concerning before the pandemic hit, because we knew that some voters lacked ID when that law was passed, and there were disparities in who possessed ID and who didn't. Young people, people of color, some older people were less likely to have the kinds of ID that the state allowed or required for voting than were other voters. Those disparities have become more apparent during the pandemic because the IDs are necessary to even request the absentee ballot in the first place. There's a technological barrier for some voters because the way that most people would request an absentee ballot is online. by uploading a copy of their license or passport or other acceptable ID. That requires a facility with technology, usually a mobile device, a good Wi-Fi or cell connection. Not everyone in the state has. And so voters make mistakes, as they do with other parts of the absentee voting process. So I think there's actually an interaction of the ID requirement, which has come to be more problematic for people who are voting not at a polling place and need to provide a copy of the ID in advance, and the absentee balloting rules, which are wonderful and necessary during a pandemic and are used pretty effectively by most voters. But for a sizable subset of voters, the absentee voting requirements are really challenging. Now, Ellen also asked about fraud and to what degree these provisions might be designed to prevent fraud. What evidence do we have that fraud is happening among voters? We have pretty good evidence that fraud is pretty rare. Not that it never happens, but it's the exception. It can be counted typically on one hand in an election. It's not typically coordinated or widespread or systematic. And the important thing to note is when fraud does happen, it's often detected and prosecuted. And the kinds of frauds that happen actually aren't prevented by voter ID requirements or by many of the requirements on absentee voting. The examples you will hear about sometimes are a person attempting to vote twice, or someone who is just out of incarceration, who's on parole or probation, attempting to vote. Those are often misunderstandings or administrative problems rather than intentional fraud. And the truth is the voter ID requirement, even the Wisconsin requirement, which is one of the strictest in the country, doesn't prevent either of those problems from happening. The ID requirement only stops voter impersonation. One voter pretending to be another voter at the polling place or when requesting an absentee ballot. That is exceptionally rare. It's very difficult to find any cases in any part of the country of one voter impersonating another. So if there are going to be security provisions to try to reduce fraud or other problems, right now they are targeted at the wrong places. They are not targeted at the vulnerable parts of the voting process, and yet they do create obstacles for voters. One reform we might think about for this year that I think makes both liberals and conservatives happy are tracking opportunities for monitoring your absentee ballot. For voters who are concerned about their ballot not being sent to them on time or about it not getting back to the election office in time, having online tracking gives them the peace of mind to know where that ballot is. And if the ballot's not going to make it, they can go to the polling place on election day as a fail-safe and cast a ballot in person. But it's also a tool for the election official. If they are concerned about a ballot being intercepted or someone filling it out who shouldn't be filling it out, they can check online to see where that ballot is in the stream, in the mail stream, or whether it's in the voter's hands. So those kinds of tools, which are being adopted pretty rapidly in a lot of states, including Wisconsin, I think we should continue to develop because they do really satisfy lots of parts of the process and will help smooth absentee voting for everyone in these very difficult times.
Thank you. Because we want to get to the really good questions that have been submitted by alumni as well as Ripon residents, we're going to forego the 10-minute discussion among the panelists. And those of you who are viewing, we do have a couple of questions coming in, but you are absolutely welcome to click on Q&A, question and answer, and submit a question. So the first question is from an alumna of 2019, and I'll ask that Dr. McBride and Dr. Turner address this one. Were there any difference in terms of race when women got the right to vote? And if so, would you please speak to the fact that women of color kept out of the polls, or was it harder for them to get registered? What is your perspective on the importance of women voting in today's political climate? We can begin with Dr. McBride.
Thank you. Yeah, I was sad to see that question, partly because it wasn't stated as a question, but as a statement of fact, and it's not a fact. We have to take care. I hope the history majors are watching and know we avoid sweeping statements. It's made as a sweeping statement that women of color were not allowed in the polls, and that's just not true. At least I didn't see it stated as I have sometimes this year, as that the 19th Amendment was racist. It was not, and that's an attack on Susan B. Anthony at a time when we're celebrating her work and her words. Remember, she wrote the 19th Amendment. It has nothing about race in it. You can look for a very good discussion of this at length if you Google the name Martha S. Jones at National Geographic. She is the professor of Black Studies at Johns Hopkins University, has done a lot of work and books on this topic. I'll just quote a little bit from Dr. Jones here. She calls it a myth, and she writes to dispel that myth. I would point out, let's focus our effort on where the problems are, not where they aren't or weren't. She points out that if there was discrimination, there certainly was, it was by state law. It had nothing to do with the 19th Amendment. These were the Jim Crow laws. And the kinds of things that Barry was just talking about that we saw in past, poll taxes, and we have an equivalent in Florida today, some say, for felons, literacy tests, other ways of intimidating people from voting. But that was Black men as well as Black women, and some others too. There were some issues of class and ethnicity in some places where they prevented. So she says it's a falsehood. She tells us in fall 1920, many Black women showed up at the polls. Many did manage to vote. And I just last week was having one of my fun days of wandering through the iconographic collection at the Library of Congress, and there's a picture of Black women voting in Louisville, Kentucky, which is news lately, in 1920. And she points out that some had been voting for several years in states that had suffrage early, like California, Illinois, and New York. So she points out even that in St. Louis, which was a problem state for Black women and women in general, in Missouri, a teacher turned organizer set up a suffrage school at the Phyllis Wheatley branch of the YWCA, and newspapers reported that as a result, nearly every woman in the city, Black or white, registered to vote in 1920. So we need to take care, as Dr. Jones states, as was true in 1920. A woman's access to the polls is determined by where she lives, and Dr. Burton just spoke to that. We still have these state laws that are restricting the vote for African-American women, other women, and men. And we have to see the end, she calls, of the voter ID laws, the shuttering of polling places. As we saw last April, it was appalling when my city of Milwaukee, just 2 years ago, I've moved now, but they could only find poll workers for 5 polling places in the entire city. And you may have seen a photo that went nationwide of somebody standing in front of the Riverside High School polling place with the sign, "This is ridiculous." That photo was taken by a UWM journalism student who's getting good job offers now. That would have been where I would have had to go and stand in line. I am one of those voters with a disability. I have post-polio syndrome, one of the last people with it. I would not have been able to stand for hours. And I do want to speak to say what Dr. Burton said. When last spring, I figured out, well, I'm going to have to figure out how to absentee ballot because I'm in the highest vulnerability group with age and my health condition for the pandemic. It is not easy. There are only 2 states where ballots, despite what the president says, there are only 2 states where ballots are automatically sent out. Others, like Milwaukee, are sending out applications. And it's not easy to fill out the application. And yes, I had to figure out the technology to decide how to send a picture of my driver's license. And I had to wait, but I do want to highly recommend the tracking option at myvote.gov that Dr. Burton recommended. We have already voted, my husband and I, we delivered our votes to our village hall, not taking a chance with the mails out in a rural area where we are now. And the very next day on myvote.gov, I could see that my absentee ballot had been received. Use it, it's great. Now I'll be watching to see, as has happened the other 2 elections, I voted absentee now, whether my ballot is counted.
Thank you, Dr. McBride. Dr. Turner, what are your opinions on this question?
Yes, first of all, I agree with Dr. McBride that the 19th Amendment did not in any way exclude any specific group of women within the country. However, we as a country have to face our very deep-rooted racism and the issues that have risen from it. So the issues that arose around the access to the vote for women of color did indeed arise from issues surrounding in different states. And this was truly the Jim Crow area. And we know that true access and complete voting right acts was not actually accomplished in America till 1965. You know, if we look at the history, actually voting rights for women kind of grew out of the abolitionist movement. And Sojourner Truth was one of the first women to combine the two of them, voting rights and abolition together. And that's where a lot of this activity started. So there were always women of color, and particularly Black women, African-American women involved in voting rights. And in fact, one of the interesting things that I think is worth looking at was that in 1896, there was a National Association of Colored Women was formed with the goal of addressing discrimination based on gender and race, including issues related to suffrage. And this was started by Mary Church Terrell as one organization. She was the organization's first president. And that group, of course, not only dealt with voting rights, but many other rights of discrimination, issues around discrimination in our country. We have to acknowledge the fact that as 1920 happened and the amendment was passed, that there was still a lot of active prejudice going on in our country. We just have to acknowledge that. And for example, when the Great March was done in Washington, D.C., it was, I'm not excusing Washington, D.C., in Chicago, it was really phenomenal.
1915.
Yeah, right, yeah. And unfortunately, it was asked that the women of color march at the back of that march because of the pretty much, the discrimination that was going on. Interesting enough, the majority of discrimination didn't necessarily come from white women. It came from their male counterparts. And that's what we were struggling with. So there indeed were difficulties. There were barriers to voting for women of color, but there were many states that, had voting past suffrage prior to even 1920, Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Kansas, Michigan, Montana, Nevada, New York, Oklahoma, Oregon, South Dakota, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming. Western states were really ahead of us when it came to suffrage because they wanted to attract women to their states, it's said. The other thing to remember is that when we talk about discrimination and the difficulty with voting with women of color, it was not just only Black women, but we look at, for example, Indigenous women who have continue significantly to be disenfranchised to this day, along with their male counterparts. In 1924, Indigenous people were allowed to be citizens of the United States, which is just a mind-boggling thought that this was their country, right? But they really didn't get voting rights until 1947. Chinese immigrants weren't even allowed citizenship until 1943. So there was a lot of discrimination going on regarding groups of color that we've had to face, we have to acknowledge. But I do acknowledge that the 19th Amendment wasn't written with the plan of disenfranchising Black women or brown women or any women. It was written for the sake of getting women the right to vote. Unfortunately, some of the things that came out of it and the way the amendment was used did cause discrimination.
Yeah, I would point out there was racism in the suffrage movement. That might have been
yes.
a better question. But there also was sexism in the civil rights movement.
Right.
Our social movements reflect our society, good and bad. They can show the best of us. They can show the worst of us. You mentioned Mary Church Terrell, and it's interesting. She and Carrie Chapman Catt were good friends. And Carrie Chapman Catt spoke very clearly in 1917 when this became quite the issue as suffrage was coming. She said, all women are included. No, we're not going there. All women are included. I like to think that was the best of the Midwest speaking. But here in the Midwest, you mentioned that wonderful organization, the NACW. One of my students got to archive their records in Wisconsin, and they were wonderful. And I came across, it's in my first book, in 1900, the General Federation of Women's Clubs, white women essentially, met in Milwaukee. The organization also was brand new, only 4 years old. And a woman named Josephine Sampere Buffin of Boston had sent in her request for credentials, and she was given them. She was a member of the New England Women's Club and other clubs. She showed up at the doors of the Pfister Hotel in Milwaukee And oh my Lord, did things blow up. Josephine Sanpere Rifin, a journalist again, was African American. And, you know, they hadn't asked for a picture ID. So the Southern women in the General Federation of Women's Clubs blew up. And it was wonderful to read the woman who would become president of our state suffrage association, who at that point was the president of the Club Women in Wisconsin, who had granted the credentials. She was also a journalist. It's on the cover of my first book. I held her job decades after she did. And she went ballistic in the press. She was handling publicity for the club convention. The Southern white women did vote it down. That Black woman was not allowed to be part of that organization. But a lot of women fought back, and God bless them. So our lesson today is, if you see it, fight it.
Thank you, Dr. McBride. We have lots of good questions coming in, so I want to thank the audience for that. Dr. Burden, this next question is for you. It's submitted by an alumna of 1994, as well as, we combined two, an alumna of 1972 and a former Ripon College trustee. Since a large number of participants in this webinar are likely students, could you, Dr. Burden, give a summary of recent court decisions affecting the use of student IDs as valid voter ID in Wisconsin? And what is the best way to encourage young people to vote, since many do not believe that voting matters?
Yeah, two great questions. The ID law in Wisconsin that was passed back in 2011 did include college student IDs as an approved form of identification for voting, along with driver's licenses, passports, military IDs, and a few others. But it also required some special provisions on those IDs that most colleges in the state don't actually include. Things like a signature of the student, a picture of the student, and an expiration date that is no more than 2 years, or an issuance date that is no more than 2 years before the election in which the student wants to vote. Most universities in the state had actually removed some of those provisions, including the signature, because it was viewed as a security risk. At my university, for example, the student ID is also a swipe card that is used to purchase meals, to check out library books, to get into dormitories, to get into sometimes high security labs. It's a cash card. It has a lot of value. And so the university had removed the signature sometime before. That meant that most student IDs around the state were not eligible to be used. And that's still the case today, even with lawsuits back and forth that have modified the law somewhat. Universities whose IDs don't comply, which is most, have started to offer a secondary ID that a student can pick up for purposes of voting. But that is not issued automatically in most cases, and so it's an extra step that students have to take. And if the expiration date on the ID card doesn't meet the letter of the law, students also have to provide proof of enrollment to show that they are current and have paid their fees. There's no other voter in the state that has to show two things as form of ID, but our college students do, both the ID and proof of enrollment. So I think the question may be getting at a couple of lawsuits that were filed last year that deal with this proof of enrollment piece. One of them under the 27th Amendment to the Constitution, which lowered the voting age to 18. The other dealing, I think, with a provision of state law. And they both said essentially this is an unfair treatment of young voters by asking them to do something that other voters are not. Just in the last few weeks, the judge in the federal case took a look at the case that was filed by Common Cause and said that he was not going to rule before the election because there were too many other moving pieces in the days before the election, and he wouldn't want any ruling he made to then be appealed and potentially changed in the days just before the election. There's something in the law known as the Purcell principle, after a case named after Purcell, that says essentially you should not be adding additional requirements to the voting process in the days just before the election. And so this judge's concern was that if he made modifications to the rule, he may be overruled by an appeals court in the Seventh Circuit, and that would violate the Purcell principle. So those two cases dealing with student IDs are on hold, I think, until after the election, and will be dealt with sometime after 2020. So stay tuned. This is the land of lawsuits, and most things about Wisconsin elections are now litigated, and it's the courts that end up deciding them. The other question is how to motivate students or how to engage students in the voting process, and I think that's a big task for all of us. We know that young people have the lowest voting rates, not just in presidential elections, but even more severely in midterm elections, local elections, primaries. So it's in presidential elections that we have the best case, where turnout among young people tends to rise the most. It's really unfortunate that the age at which a person becomes eligible to vote, 18, is also a time in people's lives when they are most unsettled. When they're moving, often out of a parent's home to an apartment or to a college for the first time, when they may be changing jobs, when their life circumstances are evolving. And that makes it really difficult to establish the habit of voting. For me, voting is not difficult because I live in the same place. I've lived in the same place for 15 years. I registered when I moved here. I have an identification. I know the politics of my area, what the issues are, who the candidates are. I'm rooted in this community. For young people, most of those things are not true. They are moving from one location to another, so they may be unfamiliar with the politics of the new place. They have to become registered in the new place. They have to figure out the voting process. Do they want to cast a ballot where they live, or if they're a college student, by absentee back maybe at a parent's home? So a voting process that is already foreign to a lot of us and is kind of challenging administratively is extra challenging for young people because they're encountering it for the first time and while undergoing mobility and disruption in their lives. The surprising thing, maybe it will surprise you, is that surveys show that young people are just as interested as older folks in voting. They show just as much interest in casting a ballot. They are as enthusiastic about voting in presidential elections as their older counterparts, but they get deterred along the way because of these challenges. The thing that surprised me more was surveys showing that young people didn't always feel confident that they knew enough to vote. There are questions put to the public in national surveys asking people whether they feel competent. Do you know enough to vote? Could that be a reason why you're not participating? And I was surprised to hear that young, smart people were saying in surveys like that, they didn't feel like they were ready to vote. They didn't know enough about the candidates. Well, there are plenty of people voting who don't know lots of things about the candidates. And I wanted to convince our students, I think this is a real task for all of us, that it's not a test. You have some values and some things you care about. It's not difficult to learn some basic facts about the presidential candidates. We're all flooded with information, especially in battleground states like ours. And so any choice you make, I think, is a good one. And I really want to encourage young people to jump into the arena.
Thank you very much.
Ellen, can I speak to some specific things that work?
No, I'm sorry, Dr. McBride. We have so many questions, and now I'm going to limit your responses to 2 minutes, and I will time you so that we can get to some of the other questions that are coming in there. Fabulous, fabulous questions. So this is a question for all three of you. You will be timed. I will give you the signal when you're at 1 minute. And the question is, and we'll begin with Dr. Turner, we will go to Dr. Burden, and then you, Dr. McBride. How do voter ID requirements affect enfranchisement? And do you think there may be intimidation of voters at polling places on election day?
Yes, first of all, how do voter ID affect disenfranchisement? Well, first of all, there are 11% of voters who do not have a voter ID from the government. 25% of minorities don't. And so therefore, if you don't have that voter ID, you're disenfranchised. But the other thing is that it's not just about getting the ID. Even when the ID is free, sometimes it's an issue of getting to where you can get the ID. If you need a birth certificate, you have to get a birth certificate, which costs money. You have to travel to the site. There are some places in this country, particularly like, for example, in Texas, where it's 170 miles to their nearest ID office. So all those things can disenfranchise voters. And then the kind of voter IDs that are used, for example, like we said, we can't use your student ID, but you can use your gun license ID. So things like that, yes, there are states that are like that too. So those kind of things are frustrating and are disenfranchising to people. As far as your second part of the question was, will there be intimidation? Yes, we've already seen intimidation. We've seen groups at polling sites who are, basically gently or more than gently harassing groups as they come to vote. And one of the key things here, we say, we're going to see it. We're going to see it more. There's no question about it. And I use basically the process that I use where I work now. The key is to not engage and to take someone to vote with. Vote as a group, vote with a friend, go with someone so you have somebody to socialize with as you're doing the voting, and you will be more able to ignore and not be engaged with those who are trying to disenfranchise you at the voting site. Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Burden.
I don't have a lot to add about the good comments Deborah made about voter identification laws. I will reiterate my earlier point that with people voting absentee at such higher rates, the ID law has taken on greater importance because it's needed to start the absentee voting process. That's already a 2-week process. The way you get an ID in Wisconsin, if you don't have one, is to go to a DMV. Those are the offices that issue state IDs. That requires going in person. There's not an option to do that electronically, and some counties have pretty limited locations and times for DMVs. It requires transportation and a willingness to take a risk to do face-to-face meeting in an office. So there is that ongoing challenge, I think, that exacerbates the underlying inequalities in who possesses ID. I hope that we don't have intimidation and obstacles at the polls. I did hear recently that our state election officials are actually training local election officials in de-escalation techniques, the kind of techniques that maybe workers in a retail setting might learn if there's a tension in the store, to try to diffuse those, or a police officer might learn. Unfortunately, that's something that election officials and poll workers may have to deal with. There should be fewer people at the polls this year because so many are voting by mail, but that doesn't make the problem go away. And fortunately, I think our polls in Wisconsin have a lot of openness. It's easy for an observer to just walk into a polling place, and my students journalists have really appreciated that. But it does make for a pretty open process that I think is vulnerable to that kind of activity. So it's something you have to be vigilant about, and I think Deborah's recommendations about how to navigate that as a voter are well taken.
Thank you. Dr. McBride.
The advice to take a friend with you, do that if somebody needs help in getting the voter ID. Take them with you to the campus registrar's office. If you have to get the sticker that goes on the driver's license, take them with you to the DMV office. And yes, it's a problem now for those of us with disabilities who are older. I'm due to get mine renewed, and they're only allowing 5 people in at a time. At least they've reopened those offices. And I'm gonna have to wait outside, and I'm probably gonna have to bring along a chair to sit on if it takes time. So go with somebody to do that, because that's what works to get people voting. Parents, take your children to the polls. My mother took me, just like she took me to her League of Women Voters meetings. That mattered. And when my daughter turned 18, she went to the polls with me, so proud, as she got to vote for a woman for president. That was rather amazing. What I find in talking to students, they don't know what a ballot's going to look like. There are sample ballots published in newspapers and available online. Look at it. If you say, oh my Lord, there's 27 things I have to vote for, you don't have to vote for all of them, but that gives you time to research. And when I talk to my students at UWM, where the #1 issue is always parking, and they'd complain and I'd say, what are you doing about it? I said, who did you vote for alderman? Oh, I don't vote, or I only vote for president. I said, yeah, and the alderman knows that. And that's why he doesn't listen to you. Some of my students organized a campaign. They replaced the alderman, and they got better parking rules around our campus, because we can show students why it matters. They may not be paid taxes yet in property taxes, which gets a lot of people voting, but they are if it's in their rent. Explain that to them. You don't have to own property to be paying property taxes. It's in your rent. And you're probably paying more taxes than the president is. So it matters. And show them that, why it matters. And you can see sample ballots. They're there as learning tools. Get online, look in the paper, and there's lots of ways to learn to use your ballot.
Thank you, Dr. McBride. Brian, are there any questions that have been submitted that you're interested in asking panelists?
Yes, our attendees have been submitting questions. Here's one from
2-minute
Ripon,
answers.
a Ripon College alumna from 1989. And what she would like to know is, would the Equal Rights Amendment be of utility in ensuring that everyone can vote and every vote counts equally? So who would like to respond on the panel to that? 2 minutes apiece.
It's my cause.
Okay, go ahead.
I actually
Dr.
was
McBride.
born on the anniversary of the 19th Amendment. I turned 21 on August 26, 1970, when the National Organization for Women marched around this country, and I got to see a march in Milwaukee to bring back the ERA, which was proposed in 1923 by Alice Paul at the 75th anniversary celebration of the Seneca Falls Convention. Alice Paul, the National Women's Party. It went to Congress. It languished in Congress, just like the Anthony Amendment did for decades. National Organization for Women got it back up and out there, and we almost made it, except for Phyllis Schlafly, if you've been watching that video series. It matters. Right now, we women do not have equal rights in this country. That's why it's called ERA. We need constitutional protection of what we think are our rights, but they're not. We have gained a lot of access to the military, where we're 15%, but we don't have constitutional protection for that place in the military. We don't have constitutional protection of Roe v. Wade. We need constitutional protection of many of what we assume are our rights, but actually are only privileges by law and not under the Constitution. We need the ERA. In this state, by the way, I also did research and published, we had the first state ERA in 1921. The men caved because they didn't know how women were going to vote. But we saw how it could be overturned by the legislature within 3 years. Parts of it survived. And if you are a student, you are benefiting. If you have only one parent, and that's your mother paying your tuition, that was not allowed before. Until the 1970s, mothers could not sign the driving license applications for students to take driving lessons. That kind of nonsense. They fought in the 70s as they had in the 20s. We need to keep fighting a century later and win the ERA before I die.
Thank you, Dr. McBride. Here is a question from a teacher who is attending tonight. And she said she's working towards her license in secondary education and is writing a lesson plan on the importance of citizenship. In this country, voting is one of the most important core tenets of citizenship. How can I, as a teacher, most effectively verbalize to my middle school students in a way which will give them a passion and appreciation for voting and involve citizenship as a whole? He also says, thank you for this excellent webinar. Dr. Turner, do you think you'd like to take a crack at that on how to get middle school students excited about voting?
Yeah, yes, and voting at any level, whether it's middle school or as an adult or earlier, is that you have to have an issue or a passion that you're interested in. So I would suggest to the middle school teacher, first of all, giving the basics and teaching them about voting and how it works. And, but then to pick out issues that are critical to them. Maybe it's something about their school. Maybe you can get your principal or your school board engaged in letting the students vote on a given issue, allowing them to build a platform, have discussions, present their cases just as if they were having a caucus or a voters education piece, and then actually having them vote. And then showing them how the vote comes out and whether their issue wins or loses. Talking about it and teaching them the rules is great, but if they can see where it's going to impact their life as a student, that I think it'll make a lot of difference. And my son was kind of engaged in one of those situations when he was in school several years ago, and he got really excited about it. And he's a born and raised voter right now. Of course, he had to go to the polls with me too when he was younger. But the fact that if you can make it relevant, then they will be engaged. So I think that's the easiest way to do it.
And yay,
Dr.
teachers. My degree is
Dr. Burton, do
secondary
you have a
education.
comment, a suggestion for the teacher?
Yeah, I endorse that idea. I think the issue as a passion is the way to draw students in. It's wonderful to teach about the three branches of government, but I'm not sure that's the place to start in middle school. That's not engaging. But if there's a question in their school that is of some controversy, or in the neighborhood, or in their state, it could be school lunches, what is provided in the school cafeteria, or it could be the speed limit on the road that passes in front of the school, getting students involved in that way. And as they pursue the issue, they learn about the pieces of government that are relevant to changing those rules. I think the other thing that could be used pretty effectively that worked on me as a student were mock elections. Mm-hmm. To have an election in your school. I remember doing that in 4th grade for a presidential election, and the results were announced over the speakers in the school. And it was exciting to people whose candidate won, and, you know, demoralizing to the others. But I think it got everyone engaged in the kind of, maybe the entertainment value or the kind of struggle part of it. But that's frankly what brings people in. I think for young people, that could be really effective.
Here's a question for another attendee. This is an alumna from 1972, and she wants to know, is the Electoral College likely to be under attack in the future if this election proves that elections may be manipulated by state legislatures? Dr. Turner, do you want to begin with this?
Sure, I can start with this. First of all, I just should probably let you know that the League of Women Voters has had a part of one of our policies and issues is that the elimination of the Electoral College, and that's been on our books for a long time. We have not spent a lot of time recently working on this, but clearly I think we're going to see this in the future, and not just about, it's not going to be just about this election, because as we look back at the last multiple elections and recognize the presidents that were elected not by popular vote, but by electoral vote. And if we look at the representation of how many voters are represented by a given, for example, senator in our Senate, that people are going to start realizing that people's voices are not being heard. So yes, that this will definitely be an issue. And probably, if you may not know, there's something called the, National Popular Vote Compact, which is an organization that has been working to get states to sign up so that if the whoever wins the most votes in a presidential election, they would take all of their electoral votes and cast them for that candidate. Currently, there are 16 states that have signed up. That's at 176 electoral votes. So they need 16 more electoral votes from several other states. If they reach that, then this could be a compact that could be used in the future. So there's very much interest in looking at this of how we should use the popular vote as opposed to the Electoral College vote.
Dr. Burton, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think there are some other kind of perverse side effects of the Electoral College that people may not realize. We already talked about some states getting all of the attention and other states being ignored. That's a kind of obvious one that really runs against, I think, norms that we've all internalized as Americans now about the vote being equal, regardless of where you live. But I think also having this state-based system raises some security issues. If you are concerned about Russian actors or others trying to infiltrate election systems, that's a problem because they know they can get into one key state and cause a disruption nationwide. It's very unlikely if there was a single nationwide popular vote that those actors would have the same interest in doing that. It just wouldn't, changing 1,000 votes in Wisconsin or raising uncertainty in Florida wouldn't have the same effect if we were focused on the national popular vote. In addition, the kind of concern about recounts, we've done a recount in Wisconsin after the last presidential election, and there were efforts in other states. Those would be of less concern because you're not going to have these sort of pivotal states with small numbers of votes deciding the outcome of the presidential election. So I do like the interstate compact. I think it's the one reform that can happen and have a really tremendous immediate effect without having to modify the Constitution.
Dr. McBride, do you want to add anything to that?
Just one thing to go way back almost to the beginning. I'm not sure the connection was made. And sometimes students need to review those middle school civics classes to remember this. Dr. Turner spoke very strongly to the importance of participating in the census. The deadline is coming. And for students or teachers who want to learn more about that, actually one of my best friends, a UWM History Department colleague, Dr. Margot Anderson, is the expert on this. And you can find her books like Who Counted to show you the significance of the census in not just our voting, but our funding for the next 10 years. How many people are in a town is going to matter. But let me make another link to the topic we were just on. When Dr. Turner talked about the census determines the number of representatives each state has in the House. And we saw that, those of us my age in Wisconsin remember, we used to have one more. We lost that with the population drop. But let me make the clear link. Remember this, who's in the Electoral College? Members of Congress. So when the census is determining the number of votes of representatives we have in the House, it's also determining the number of votes we have in the Electoral College. Wisconsin has 10 votes in the Electoral College. Let's see if we can get it back to 11 if everybody fills out that census.
Thank you. We have time, I think, for one more question. This comes from a journalist who is attending tonight, and he would like the panelists to discuss the Supreme Court's 2013 Shelby County versus Holder ruling that parts of the Civil Rights Act were unconstitutional. How has that impacted on voting over the last 7 years, and will it continue to impact on voting? Who would like to go first on that one?
I can say something
Dr.
about
Burton,
that.
go ahead.
Yeah, so as Deborah mentioned, the Voting Rights Act had these two provisions in Section 4 and Section 5 that required some states to get pre-approval before they made changes to their election laws. So they typically needed the federal government to sign off on those changes to prevent them from being discriminatory. They were places like Florida, North Carolina, Texas, mostly in the South, where there were histories of racial discrimination. But that formula was set aside by the Supreme Court in the Shelby County decision. And very quickly, those states that had been held up by the pre-clearance rule began to change election laws that had been stopped by federal review. I think it was the day after Shelby County was passed, the opinion was released, that North Carolina enacted a fairly strict voter ID law. State of Texas also enacted a fairly strict voter ID law that, again, that had been something that state legislators were interested in those states, but the Voting Rights Act was protecting against. But those are maybe the highest profile examples, but there are lots of other lower level changes that get less attention on the ground. Things that are happening on the ground that get less attention elsewhere, things like the consolidation of polling places, which has happened at a pretty fast clip in a lot of, especially southern states. That's now permitted because there's no formula requiring those states to be reviewed. But also changes to election machines, voter list maintenance or voter purges, as Deborah mentioned. All of those things are really now only at the whim of state legislators and state law rather than a review by the courts or by the Attorney General.
Dr. Turner, you want to make some additional remarks on that?
No, I think that, that totally really covers it. And once again, I put a plug in here for us to, reach out to our legislators and let them know that it's really critical, very critical to reenact the Voting Rights Advancement Act, now known as the John R. Lewis Voting Act of 2020. This will reinstate parts of that Section 5 in a way that I think are very valuable and are going to be useful. And until we do that, we will be able to continue to live under the threat of possible voter disenfranchisement by areas, states, districts who choose not to have fair and equal voting access. So it's critical. Talk to your legislators about this. Reach out to them. You want it passed.
Dr. McBride, you have the last word on this question.
Oh gosh, I think we might have time for another question if I say it's been dealt with brilliantly and let's move forward.
Well, I think we are reaching.
I'm a historian. That's too recent history for me. I care, but they've explained it well.
I want to tell the attendees, we had told the panelists that they would each get about 2 minutes to make some concluding remarks, and particularly to leave us all with some important things to think about or do in this as we go forward. So, Dr. Turner, can we begin with you with 2 minutes for what would you want to leave us with?
First of all, to really pay attention to everything that these great panelists have said tonight, including, I guess, what I said too. But anyway, really critically, you've heard this over and over. This is the year that you really have to plan your vote. Determine when you're going to vote, how you're going to vote, and how you're going to do that process. And I would like to promote a site called vote411.org. Vote411.org is the election or the voting access app for the League of Women Voters. And the great thing about that app is it has everything you need. It tells you no matter what your state is, you put in your address, your zip code, and you will find information on where you vote, where your polling sites are, what the laws of your state are. The other piece that's great in there, that it will have access to who the candidates are in your area. Every candidate is allowed or invited to put their information in. We do not in any way change it. It's directly from their basically their election groups or their words themselves. And so everything you need to know about voting can be there. And the great thing about it is it's being updated daily by the staff of the League of Women Voters US. So it's current information, and it's great for students who really want to go to it and find out what the heck's going on with voting in my area. So I encourage everyone to use that. And finally, I'd like to say just one little quick comment about voting if your vote counts. We must remember that in 2016, the presidential election was decided by roughly 77,000 votes. And in the states that counted, it was like 2 votes per precinct. So if you think your vote doesn't count, think about what a few more votes in several precincts across this country could make a difference for, depending on what you believe in and who you want to vote for. So your vote does count, it will count, and it is safe. So please, please vote.
Thank you. Before we go to Dr. McBride for her closing remarks, I want to ensure the attendees that you don't have to remember some of the sources that have been mentioned tonight: books, articles, people, websites. What we're going to do is the panelists are going to provide me with an email with this information, and when we send you the follow-up with the recorded link of this webinar, we will include all of these resources for you. Dr. McBride.
Well, first, thank you, Dr. Smith. And allow me to say, as a little girl who grew up going to those League of Women Voters meetings, and as a member now, the invitation to be on a panel with Dr. Turner was just a moment. And I thank you for that. It's been wonderful. I want to go back a bit to another thought about tying in what you just said about the list of sources that we're going to give, how to motivate people to vote, especially young people. Learn what it took. Learn what it took to win the Voting Rights Acts back to the 1860s and since, and why we've lost them. The history of the struggles, women suffragists called it the century of struggle, but we have had many people with many struggles in this country, many civil rights movements and voting rights movements. I gotta push reading history, or at least watching a movie about it. Look for the movie Iron Jawed Angels about the National Women's Party and the torture and imprisonment they endured so that we would be able to vote today. My students in my American history classes and women's history classes who read the histories, who learned the histories, said, I can't skip voting again. And that's how it hit me. I was luckily of that generation that got to fight for the 27th Amendment, so to vote at the age of 18. By the time we got it, I was 21, but I was glad we'd won that, as we'd sent many of my classmates off to war who didn't come back, and we wanted the right to influence the war decisions about things like the Vietnam War. And it gets hard to vote. It was hard when I was a single mom. It was hard when I had small children. But you'll get out there if you realize how many millions of people fought for you to have that right. And to do it so easily today, yes, it's hard, but we're not doing it by horse and buggy. I think, would it have taken a century for the suffragists to win if they had the technology we have today? They did it with correspondence. They did it with Susan Anthony in a horse and buggy going around the country. They welcomed the telephone. It made life a little easier. We really don't have a lot of excuses today. And we have every reason today, if ever we've seen it, any election ever, we have every reason today to vote.
Thank you. Dr. Burden, your last comments for us.
Well, on the earlier point that every vote matters and that there can be close elections, surprisingly, there's one comment here from Gary Rodman about being elected by one vote to the Ripon Area School District Board. Our presidential election in Wisconsin was decided by 23,000 votes 4 years ago. That was out of 3 million votes that were cast statewide. A very slim margin. 23,000 votes, that's about the size of the crowd at a Milwaukee Bucks basketball game.
It's UWM.
Deciding who is the next president of the United States. So you don't know when or where, but there will be an election in your experience that is close enough that your vote will really feel impactful in that way. The other thing I would say is that there are lots of ways to be involved in politics and the public sphere, and they all have value. We've seen a lot of social protest and other kinds of movements this year, and really since the Black Lives Matter movement began a few years ago. There have been marches, the Women's March that happened around the time of Trump's inauguration. But, some people write their member of Congress, other people write op-eds and, letters to the editor of the newspaper. You can give money to a candidate, you can volunteer for a cause. Those are all wonderful things, but I think the vote is special because it's the one kind of action that is equal for all people. It's the one time when all of us as citizens have equal weight in determining who will represent us and hopefully what they will do. And so it has a kind of special place for that reason that makes it different from other kinds of participation. And it's really the bottom line in terms of the things that politicians care about is the voters who will be supporting them or voting against them. So I encourage everyone to take advantage of that opportunity as well as others. There's no single channel that's the best way to participate, but voting has a special place. It's how democracy works.
Thank you all. As I begin my concluding remarks and thanking people, I'd encourage the panelists to look at the chat room. There's some wonderful tributes to you all for the conversation. Take a look. I think that people really appreciated the sharing of your wisdom, your experience, and your encouragement on how we can make the suffrage more effective. So I want to thank you, the panelists and moderator, for a very informative conversation on the challenges in our time to expand and protect suffrage, building on the accomplishments of heroines and heroes of our past. And thank you all who've attended this evening and for all your questions. Unfortunately, we did not have time for the panelists to cover them all, but I hope we covered enough so that you could take something from this wonderful conversation. Our next webinar will occur on Tuesday evening, October 20th, also at 6:30 p.m. And the topic will be, get ready, fake news and conspiracy theories in the age of Trump. Dr. McBride, you'll have to control yourself. We will hear Michael Isikoff speak about the importance of a free press in our democracy.
He's terrific.
He is the chief investigative correspondent for Yahoo News and the co-author, along with David Korn, of the book Russian Roulette, The Inside Story of Putin's War on America and the Election of Donald Trump, as well as several other best-selling nonfiction books. That webinar on October 20th will be moderated by Professors Henrik Schatzinger and Steve Martin of Ripon College, and it will be co-sponsored with and funded by the Menard Center for the Study of Institutions and Innovation at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I want to thank you all again for participating tonight and for attending, and take all of these wonderful, inspiring remarks you've heard and encouragement from our panelists to heart, and go and vote, vote, vote. Thank you and good evening.